War is a racket. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the few, at the expense of the very many. Out of war a few people make fortunes. Out of war nations acquire additional territory. If they are victorious, they just take it. This newly acquired territory is promptly exploited by the few, the self-same few who wrung the dollars out of the blood and war. The general public foot the bill. Medley D. Butler.
Something like 1984 could actually happen. This is the direction the world is going in at the present time. There will be no loyalty except loyalty to the party. But always, there will be the intoxication of power. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen.
The Standard Oil subsidiary in London immediately delivers $20 million worth of the anti-knock additive to the Nazis, and this despite the immediate danger of war. Hitler is now able to annex the Sudetenland and prepare his attack on Czechoslovakia. Just before Hitler's invasion of Poland, summer 1939, the English once more supply lead tetraethyl to the value of $15 million. With this, the first blitz attacks against England can be launched.
This country was not made by people who sat in their own communities and followed their own private interests. Instead, it was made by the men who recognized that change means progress. Progress means the welfare of our people. That's what makes this a great country.
The real problem is this, James. 2 decades, there will be 7 billion human beings on this planet. Most of them brown, yellow, or black. All of them hungry. All of them determined to love. They'll swarm out of their breeding grounds into Europe and North America. Hence Vietnam. An all-out effort there will give us control of South Asia for decades to come. And with proper planning, we can reduce the population to 550 million by the end of the century. I know. I've seen the data.
We sound rather like gods reading the Doomsday Book, don't we?
Well, someone has to do it. Not only will the nations affected be better off, but the techniques developed there can be used to reduce our own excess population. Blacks, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, poverty-prone whites, and so forth.
I had seen this plane flying into the first building. It was a TV segment. I had seen this plane flying into the first building.
Just seems fake. Just seems fake.
I want to know if you had known anything of Operation Northwood, which came out in '62 from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, recommending a Black Ops operation in Cuba. One of the things was to shoot down a plane full of students, et cetera, et cetera. If you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks. Mr. Ellsberg.
Yes, that's a very good question. And indeed, I conceivably could have known about it or learned about it later, because a man involved in that planning was a man who at the time was in CIA working for the White House, General Edward Lansdale. He retired, and pardon me, when I worked for him, he was a retired CIA. There were other people on the team, but he could conceivably have told me something about that operation. And indeed, I didn't. If I had learned, and when I did learn, eventually, I have to say, with all I knew about the U.S. government, I was shocked by that. James Bamford, I think, in his work on the NSA, uncovered that. There are documents about it in the National Security Archive at George Washington. And that was the most shocking project I ever saw on paper, which the Joint Chiefs had approved, of actually possibly, one possibility was killing Americans in order to get us into a war with Cuba. I learned really when I learned that and some other things that my boss had been involved in Operation Mongoose, which many, many acts of aggression against Cuba before the Cuban Missile Crisis. I realized that there were levels of secrecy that even I, who had had a dozen special compartmented clearances above top secret, I thought I knew the secrecy system. But when I realized that Lansdale had been in charge of these operations against Cuba, and that I had never heard the word Cuba from his lips in many long, long evenings of daring do and tales I was hearing about the past. I never heard Bobby Kennedy, for whom he worked, come out. I realized there were types of secrecy here that went beyond anything I'd realized, and rightly so. Northwoods deserved to be entirely secret. The counterpart, by the way, was what we learned from the British, that Blair heard from President George W. Bush the proposal to send U-2s disguised as UN planes with UN colors over Saddam's Iraq to get Saddam to shoot at them and perhaps kill the pilots, giving us a better excuse for attacking Iraq, which we lacked a very good excuse. Blair thought that wasn't a good idea. But it shows that there was a long pattern of provocation by our government in order to get us into wars of which the public would not otherwise approve.
With Saddam and his two sons out of power and out of office than in office, I believe indeed that we are. I really think it's time we learnt, as a matter of sensible foreign policy, that the way to deal with one dictatorial threat is not to back another. That the way to deal with one dictatorial threat is not to back another. That the way to deal with one dictatorial threat is not to back another. That actually the best answer to what is happening in Iran, is to allow the Iraqi people the freedom and democratic choice that we enjoy in countries like ours.
I'm a British ambassador. I was a British diplomat for 20 years. I was always very patriotic to be British. I was very, very proud. I remember when I first became a British ambassador and first went out in my own flag car with the Union Jack flying on the front as the ambassador, you know, I had a lump in my throat. It was a proud moment for me. It was only 6 months after that I discovered that in the country where I was ambassador, we and the Americans were shipping people in order for them to be tortured. And some of them were tortured to death. Now, as you may imagine, my worldview changed. It was at the same time, about a month later, we invaded Iraq against the will of the Security Council. Not just without permission of the Security Council, but in the full knowledge that if it had gone to the Security Council, we would have been voted down. And I, as a British diplomat, saw all the internal memos that went through that decision. I know for certain, I used to be head of the FCO unit that monitored Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. And I know for certain, I can tell you, that they knew there weren't any. It wasn't a mistake, it was a lie. I think it is impossible to be proud of the United Kingdom. I think when we invaded Iraq, we did to the United Nations what Hitler and Mussolini did to the League of Nations. And I think what we've done since, where the truth is often much hidden, in the bombing, if you look, Libya, disaster now, we bombed it, we killed 15,000 people when NATO bombed Sirte, something they never told you on the BBC. And did we make it better? No. I saw in Uzbekistan, I saw the gas contract signed by Enron and a company called Unocal, which George Bush Sr. was on the board, to dig out gas pipelines from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan over Afghanistan down to the Indian Ocean. And that was actually what the Afghan war was about. They'd actually had talks with the Taliban and Unocal to see if the Taliban would provide pipeline security. The person who held those talks was the consultant for Unocal, who's a certain Mr. Karzai, who after being employed by George Bush Sr. as a consultant, went on to become president of Afghanistan. That was their plan B. The Taliban wouldn't do it, so they invaded. It usually, I've seen it on the inside, it's almost always about control of resources. It is every bit as corrupt as our first speaker. I'm sorry, I'm also terrible with names, indicated. You are absolutely right, Andrew. And I can tell you it's not an academic construct. The system stinks. Westminster stinks. The British government is deeply, deeply immoral. They don't care how many people they kill abroad if it advances them. And anybody who votes no is voting to support a psychologically flawed, a pathological state, which is a danger in the world, a rogue state, a state prepared to go to war to make a few people wealthy. That's why I say it's not possible to be a decent person and vote no, and we shouldn't be ashamed to say that.
Greetings, citizens of the world, we are anonymous. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation said the agency has no evidence the married couple accused of killing 14 people in San Bernardino, California earlier this month had any connection to an active terror cell. This admission from the FBI directly contradicts media reports that immediately claimed the San Bernardino shooters were linked to Daesh. Speaking at a counterterrorism conference in New York, Director James Comey said Syed Farook and Tashfeen Malik were inspired by ISIS, but were not directly involved with any specific terror group. Reuters reports that Comey believes ISIS has revolutionized terrorism by using social media to spread propaganda to inspire small-scale attacks. Another piece of the puzzle that must be considered pertains to conflicting eyewitness accounts of the San Bernardino shooting.
One of the witnesses today is Sally Abdelmajid, who works at the Inland Regional Center, the building where the attack took place. She saw the attackers enter the building, and we spoke to her by phone.
Sally Abdelmajid told CBS's Scott Pelley that she saw what appeared to be 3 white men dressed in military clothes.
And we saw a man fall to the floor. Then we just looked and we saw 3 men dressed in all black military attire with vests on. They're holding assault rifles, and they opened up the door to building 3, and one of them opens up the door to building 3. He starts to shoot. He just, shoots all over into the room.
But wait, that is not the only witness.
Where I was at right here, we seen there was 3 white men in military fatigues taking off.
Their account matches the original report from Southern California's Fox 11, which tweeted that police were searching for 3 white males dressed in military gear. Whatever the truth is, it seems obvious the government will use this crisis to add more fuel to the fire that is the global war on terror. This fire and the insanity it breeds threatens to consume the planet, leaving behind a scorched earth devoid of common sense and critical thinking. Avoiding catastrophe and further division of the people is going to take each and every awakened soul. Anonymous is for freedom. We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. Expect us.
Well, yeah, a lot of people really believe this deeply, that they just don't.
No.
They just don't trust you.
I'm sorry, Cooper. Yes, it is fair to call it a conspiracy. What are you saying? Are you suggesting that the notion that we are creating a plot to take everybody's guns away so that we can impose martial law
but there's certainly
is
a lot of
a
people.
Conspiracy? Yes, that is a conspiracy. Is that controversial? Except on some websites around the country?
There are certainly a lot of people who just have a fundamental distrust that you do not want to go further and further and further down this road.
Look, I mean, I'm only going to be here for another year. I don't know. When would I have started on this enterprise, right?
Professor Marandi, welcome to the program. First of all, I'd like to get your thoughts on the newly declassified reports revealing that Washington may have had prior information to the rise of the ISIL that also implicates the possibility of a sectarian agenda behind the issue as well.
This is a very important document, but it reveals what we have already learned years ago from other sources. I think many will recall that the New York Times a few years back wrote an important article that the U.S. government was very much, since the beginning of 2012, was behind a major airlift of equipment and weapons for the so-called Free Syrian Army and the rebels, and the Takfiris, who are fighting the Syrian government. And at the same time, less than a year ago, the U.S. Vice President Biden admitted in a speech at Harvard University that U.S. allies were behind the creation of ISIL and other extremist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and Nusra Front. So when you put two and two together and and you see that the Americans from the very, very beginning were behind the airlift as well as the vetting of commanders, according to the New York Times, and then you see the U.S. Vice President making such an admission, it only leads to the conclusion that we now see in this document that the Americans were in this from the beginning. They were using extremists against their opponents, just as they did in the 1980s in Afghanistan.
Pentagon, and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." The truth is about the Middle East is, had there been no oil there, it would be like Africa. Nobody is threatening to intervene in Africa. The problem is the opposite. We keep asking for people to intervene and stop it. And there's no question that the presence of petroleum throughout the region has sparked great power involvement. Whether that was the specific motivation for the coup or not, I can't tell you, but there's always been this attitude that somehow we could intervene and use forces.
Well, the project for a new America Century is a think tank. It's a very pretty extreme right-wing think tank, and it drafted a document in September 2000 in the course of the presidential election campaign for Bush, which is called Strengthening America's Defenses. And it makes very interesting reading. It's pretty chilling. It talks in regard to the Middle East about how the flow of oil into the international markets had been interrupted by Saddam Hussein's regime, and that it was necessary to remove that, and if necessary by military means. Don't forget, this was written in September 2000. That is a year before 9/11 and 3 years before the Iraq War. It also says, very significantly, that even if Saddam Hussein were removed from the scene, it would still be necessary to take this action in the Middle East. So the American motive is revealed by this not to be antagonism to Saddam Hussein, because who we all know is a brutal, sadistic tyrant, but it is not the human rights issues or the justice issues. It is the fact that he stood in the way of American control over oil. He used it for his interests, not the Americans' interests, and that was not acceptable to the US. What the PNAC document also goes on to say is that we need to resist any country or group of countries, for which read the EU or Japan, challenging us, challenging our leadership or our regional leadership. It talks about the need for American space forces, because the Americans supported the militarization of space and they wish to be in control of that. They talk about full spectrum dominance. In other words, American control over every aspect of military conflict, and one of those is control over the internet, so that there cannot be any cybernetic opposition to US interests. It talks about the need for more US forces in Southeast Asia. And although it doesn't actually say the need for regime change in China, that would be going too far. The implication is that we need to exert more pressure for the kind of change that we would like to see in that region. And indeed, even that has happened because China, Russia, Iran are all at the moment circled by American bases. There are now 700 bases. There are American bases across the world. There are, I think, something of the order of 135 countries out of 190 that now have American bases in them. That's about 70% of all the countries in the world. So we have seen this explosion of American power, physical control on the ground, using every opportunity. Unrest in the Caucasus, the southern flank of the Soviet Russia, the so-called Orange and Tulip and other revolutions occurring there, which is trying to get Western control of those countries to get the oil out of the Caspian. So all of this has happened, which I think largely reflects what was always the policy of the Bush administration as revealed by this PNAC document. What it ends by saying, which I think is very, very interesting, is that this, it says at the end of the document, is going to take a long time. I think you can underline those words. It's going to take a long time. Dash absent, which is the American word for except there is a catastrophic or catalyzing event like Pearl Harbor.
Is it fair to call it a conspiracy? I mean, well, yeah, a lot of people really believe this deep, that they just don't. They just don't trust you.
I'm sorry. Yes, it is fair to call it a conspiracy.